Hey, so today I want to talk about uh, agency-based ethics and just to kind of review where we're at right now. I want to point out again that for this semester we're going to look at ethics in three different ways. We're going to talk about normative ethics, which are how to deal with conflicting interests, how to solve a problem, and that's currently where we're at. We'll talk about meta-ethics, what is the nature of ethics and goodness and morality. And of course, we'll take both of these theories of normative ethics and meta-ethics and really look at how we use them to solve real life situations. So what we're looking at right now is normative ethics. And in normative ethics, there's kind of three different ways that normative ethics breaks down. Today, what we're going to be talking about is agency-based ethics, and those are the who of the situation, who are the people that are involved. There's action-based or deontological ethics, which is focused again on just the action that is happening, whether or not the act itself is a good or bad sort of thing. And then there is the consequentialist view, which is looking at the results of those actions and trying to determine whether or not a particular result is the best kind of result. So in looking at agency ethics, we can really kind of focus on a few different things. We could focus on individuals themselves, or we can focus on groups of people, individuals put together. And in this section of the ethics of care and feminist ethics, both of these take a very similar sort of argument, a similar point of view. I do want to just point out at the very beginning here that feminist ethics and the ethics of care are different things. The ethics of care comes from feminist ethics. Sometimes books will conflate these together as the same thing, but they are two entirely different points of view about ethics. But what they share is their focus on relationships. The main argument that comes from both of them is the idea that strong relationships help build a strong society. And so ethics should really focus on creating stronger relationships. The way they go about arguing that is different, but that's the reason why sometimes they can be equated as the same theory. So I want to start off by just pointing out how many different types of people exist that can call themselves a feminist. And I have this slide here for feminist ethics because a lot of times I feel like people get in their head a particular type of person as a feminist. And so I just want to point out, starting at the top left-hand corner here and kind of going clockwise around. At the very top left is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was born in Somalia, was well known as a Dutch parliamentarian, created a film called Submission, later received a death threat to her life in the form of a note that was stabbed in the chest of the director Theo Van Gogh, and really has spoken up for women's rights in a very kind of unique perspective. She's a fairly controversial figure and not always associated with feminism, but has a different strain of feminism than a lot of people are familiar with. Has worked with conservative as well as liberal groups. In the middle at the top here is Judith Butler, probably best known for the arguments that kind of surround the gender fluency debates that exist right now. Probably of all the people on this slide, the one on the top left here, Malala, is the one, Malala Yousafzai is probably the one that's the most familiar to you. And again, I would just point out that even though she is well known, what her advocacy for was women's education and women's rights in the Swat Valley. And so that's somewhat different than the other people who are here. The bottom left, this is Mary Wollstonecraft, who is often considered to kind of be the first major feminist figure. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and that was kind of the groundbreaking book in Western culture for feminist philosophy afterwards. At the bottom middle here is Paula Gunn Allen, and she's really well known for a brand of feminism called Indigenous feminism, which has found a lot of life, especially in the last 10 years or so. She really promoted a lot of different rights. I was very interested in promoting not just Native American rights, but also rights for the LGBTQ community, and really trying to, in a lot of ways, challenge the more Western notions about sexuality in general. And then on the bottom left here is Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex, probably the most groundbreaking book about feminism after Mary Wollstonecraft, inspired a lot of other writers. And interestingly enough, she did not define herself in that book or until much later, in about the 70s, as a feminist per se. She was trained more in the existentialist group, and really helped define a lot of the movements of existentialism during her time. And so again, just looking at that portrait, I want to point out the fact that if in your mind a feminist looks a particular way, there's really not a lot of truth to that. Almost anyone, including men, can be a feminist. I also kind of just want to point out that the person who we're talking about today, Bell Hooks, who is also Gloria Jean Watkins, there's a few things that I think are important to mention about her. First, I want to just point out that her name, Bell Hooks, that's spelled with the lowercase letters. When you see me writing that, I'm trying to be endearing towards her own point of view. She took on this name as a testament to her grandmother, and in all of her books that she writes, she purposely lowercases her name so as to give honor to her grandmother. And so when you see me writing her name lowercased, please do not think that I'm trying to be offensive or exclusive towards her. I'm really trying to pay her the same honor. But she's a local writer. She grew up in Kentucky. There is the Bell Hooks Institute in Berea College, not very far from here. She often comes to this part of Kentucky in Louisville to speak, and really has been one of the main constant voices of feminism since the 80s. Emma Watson, in her speech to the UN, cited Bell Hooks as the inspiration for calling herself a feminist. And really, when you get into her writings, I think she's one of the most accessible people that we will read this whole semester, because she doesn't try to use this kind of high language. She talks the way that normal people talk, and she talks about interesting things. She talks about pop culture. She talks about music, and she just really has a good sense of how people learn and what's important to most people when they're reading. And so I think she's a very readable individual herself. And one kind of final thing that I would point out about Bell Hooks is that her writing in a lot of ways probably parallels similar situations that you find yourself in. Again, she grew up in the Midwest, even though there are a few decades apart between her and yourself, perhaps. She still understands Midwestern culture, and a lot of her life has really been trying to push feminism from growing up in a Midwestern culture. And I think that's what makes her a really interesting individual as well. So just giving a quick kind of history of feminism, I do think it's important to point out that feminism can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And when people use the word feminism, it's not always altogether clear which type of feminism they're referring to. In fact, a lot of the debate in academia really centers around whether or not this is even an appropriate distinction, insofar as there's so many different strands of feminism. In Western culture, we see feminism through these kind of four major waves of change. First wave feminism really centers around the writing of Mary Wollstonecraft and this vindication of the rights of women that she wrote in 1792. But it really kind of takes up these questions about things like property ownership and voting. And really, Mary Wollstonecraft's argument in that essay is that if women are to have the nobility that is assigned to them by men, then they should be able to have rights that allow them to maintain that nobility. And so if we look at stories like, for instance, Pride and Prejudice, where we see this, a father who has four daughters and is worried about the fact that all four of them, need to be married in order for them to have economic security. We can look at the fact that, properly speaking, that there was, for most of the time that Western culture has existed, this problem of the disproportionality of men over women, and particularly of the fact that women just didn't have the same economic opportunity that men did. And so first wave feminism is really just this argument for gaining some of those basic rights that we think of as being human rights to this day. Second wave feminism really kind of starts with Simone de Beauvoir's writing of The Second Sex in 1949, and she makes a different argument than what Mary Wollstonecraft does. She argues not just that women should have the same rights as men, but that they should also have the same recognition. And you start seeing with the second wave of feminism this idea that it's not just enough to be granted a certain kind of legal status, that status also has to be meaningful. And so this is where you start seeing the arguments for things like the wage gap difference between men and women. This is where you start seeing arguments for women being able to have their own professions, being able to become not just lawyers, but even perhaps sit on judiciary benches and have a fair chance at congressional runs and things like that. Third wave feminism really kind of looks at this argument of second wave feminism and points out that a lot of the gains that are made through second wave disproportionately favor white women, and in particular white upper class women. And so third wave feminism is really kind of born from this idea that we shouldn't just focus on one particular type of woman as being empowered, but that all women should be empowered. And a lot of people date this to the 80s movement of women, where the term is actually coined itself. Third wave feminism is with a essay written by Rebecca Walker, where she points out that this problem of her boyfriend not being able to really understand where she finds herself is in the same strand of problems where no matter what identity she takes on, she always is the person who's on the bottom. And so third wave feminism really makes this argument that let's expand the notion of empowerment to not just one particular type of women, but let's empower LGBTQ women. Let's empower women of color. Let's empower people who women who have different religious affiliations, women who have different class statuses. It's primarily the movement that Bell Hooks is associated with. And finally, kind of more modern day view of feminism is what's known as fourth wave feminism, which a lot of people kind of date to the creation of the iPhone. But really, the main characteristic of fourth wave feminism is this idea of using technology to again try and empower women and give them an equal seat at the table. It's using technology to expose things like workplace harassment, office culture, being able to document the injustices that happen to women when they go out, running in the streets, just trying to show the disproportionality of everyday life through technology. And so, again, I think it's just important to focus on the fact that when people use the word feminism, like they can mean a lot of different things. Those four waves themselves are associated with Western culture, but there are other strands of feminism that extend well beyond those four ways. As I mentioned, there's indigenous feminism. There's a lot of different Islamic feminist movements right now. There's a lot of different Asian feminist movements. There's different notions of empowerment in South America and in Africa, and really just a lot of different views of how feminism is being shaped and coming together throughout the world, and remaining different as well. So bearing that in mind, it's maybe difficult to really kind of come up with an idea of like what is feminism itself. And so I think that this definition from Marie Scheer is the best example or the best definition of what feminism is. Feminism is the radical notion that women are people. And looking at this definition, I think it's a good definition because it points out something that I think is important about ethics in general. And that is when people are marginalized, when someone wants to take away somebody's humanity, we should always start with the question of, well, why? Like, what is it about that individual that you think makes them less than a human being? And what I think makes this definition so interesting is the fact that for most of human history, it has really been a radical notion to say that women are people. It's clear that when we use the word, like when we use specific words like humanity or mankind, we're referring to the rights of men more than we are referring to the rights of human beings. And so I think taken as a whole, this is a very good definition for what feminism itself actually is. That being said, I want to go ahead and focus on what makes feminist ethics themselves feminist ethics. And this really kind of begins with what I said about the foundation of having strong relationships within a society. Ethics itself, from a feminist standpoint, is about building a strong relationship between individuals. And so some ideas in connection with this is first of all, that societies that have a kind of dominating viewpoint where the one individual is able to dominate another individual, right? That's always going to indicate a lack of a strong relationship. Domination happens because someone's being taken advantage of in a relationship. And so off of this basis, feminist ethics like rejects any type of domination, but prevalently the main type of domination is patriarchal domination. And so feminism rejects patriarchal values because they dominate individuals. They take away an individual's ability to realize themselves. And so that word patriarchy itself, a lot of people feel a little iffy about, but really what patriarchy itself is just when men dominate a society. So that last part, archy, is the rule of someone over another. So an anarchist, properly understood, is someone who doesn't believe in the rule of others over another. But a patriarchy is when men rule over others, and of course the only ones they can really rule over are women and animals and things like that as well, right? But taken as a whole, feminism rejects this notion. And any society where men have this uneven control over women is going to fundamentally be an immoral society because, again, the relationship is built in such a way that women are being dominated by men. And to an extent that people don't always really acknowledge and talk about, men are actually also dominated by men in a patriarchy as well. And so to get to this point, one of the things that Bell Hooks points out is she says that love in a patriarchal culture does all of these things. She says, right, it's linked to these notions of possession. It's linked to these paradigms of domination and submission. And in particular, it's linked to that notion of domination and submission through this kind of perverted view of love, where she says it's assumed that one person gives love and another person receives it. I want to point out the next couple of slides I have are going to show some pictures that may unnerve a few people. They could properly be described as somewhat pornographic in nature, but I want to point out that they are approved for a general audience. They were ran ahead of time with that approval. And so there's nothing in it that, from a general audience standpoint, should be considered indecent. But what I want to point out is the fact that the standard of whether or not it's decent really kind of rests on this question that she's raising about how patriarchal cultures themselves create these notions of possessions. And so that being said, I just wanted to give that warning before you continue watching here. But if we look at these ads really quick, the one on the left is probably the least controversial of the three. But if we just take her words to mean what they say for a moment here, again, that love in a patriarchal culture is linked to these notions of possession. We look at the bottom left ad really quickly here, we can see that there's a couple of things that are actually going on in this ad that should make us take pause. I would point out that, like, not only does this guy have the woman on his back that he's going to take home with him, but there's also like the creepy elevator guy who's staring out right from like the open space looking at him. And I want to point out that in advertising, there are no like accidents like this. Like, there is a reason why you have the creeper elevator guy like staring out, wanting to be like the other guy. And one of the points that we could look at that Bell Hooks is making, like throughout this essay, but especially in this particular paragraph, is that this is only normalized in a society where it's assumed to be the standard of living. That is to say, the reason why this advertisement works is because we don't see anything as a whole, as a society, wrong with what it's saying. And again, it says, don't hold back, take your work home, right? And that's kind of a cutesy little thing. If we switch these roles around, if it was the girl that was holding the guy instead, I've asked classes in the past before about that, and there'll usually be people who will respond and say things like, girls can't hold guys like that, or something along those lines. But what I want to point out is like that notion of possession, the idea that a man owns a woman, is buried right in our mental psyche. And so the reason why this ad works is because Hooks is right insofar as in a patriarchal culture, when we think about love, we tend to think of it as a possessive type of relationship. The second ad here, and I just point out the fact that this is not the only ad that uses a black eye. In fact, there's a whole genre of advertising. If you Google black eye advertisements, you can see all kinds of things, everything from cigarette smokers, right, and this like quitting campaign, all the way up to like weird milk advertisements. And again, what I'd point out is this notion about domination and submission, which is very obvious in the Dolce and Gabbana ad really only works because it's normalized in a patriarchal culture. And if you think about that for a moment, think about what these ads say about the role of men and women. That Dolce and Gabbana ad on the bottom right, right, it's not only informing women about what their role is in society, it's also informing men. If you're a 9-year-old boy who's staying at a doctor's office and you see that on the back of a magazine, you automatically start to associate, right, men with this type of like overbearing power, with this idea that like women should be submissive towards men. I'd point out that in the bottom two advertisements on the right, like no one looks happy in those ads, and that maybe tells you something about what's going on as well. If you're a 9-year-old girl at a doctor's office and you see these ads, right, it tells you, even though you may have perfectly good parents, even though you may live in a society that cares about you, these types of ads inform you about what your role is in society. And so another way that we can look at this is to take up the other observation that Bell Hooks makes about patriarchy in society, where she talks about like not only does it warp love, right, but like the notion of romantic love itself. Again, in a patriarchal culture, she says it's understood to make one unaware, render one powerless and out of control. And again, if you look at these ads really quick, which again were approved for a general audience, which means that anybody of any age can look at them and see them. Like they can pop anywhere in the public. Like the reason why these ads work is because they type, or not type, right? They tap into a certain psyche about individuals. Like no person, right? No woman, let alone, right, checks the Thanksgiving turkey, right? Like the person in this bottom left advertisement does, with like, perfect makeup done, right? And these like really skimpy clothes. Like I don't think like your mother probably ever checked the Thanksgiving turkey like that before, right? Like when you look at the BK, right, advertisement, I mean, think about why it's describing things the way it is, right? Like this isn't something that like will make you feel great, it will blow your mind away, right? It describes the sandwich as a 7-incher, right? And like as you look at it, it's being very particular about how it sets up this advertisement as a sexualized like ad. And again, there's a number of different ways that you can sell that you can sell sandwiches. Like, why would this ad decide to use this particular revenue? And like, your answer might be something along the lines of, well, it's like shocking, and so that will make people remember it. But in fact, like the real reason is that it's tapping into this notion that Hooks is talking about, where romantic love in a patriarchal culture, right, renders a person unaware and powerless and out of control. And so like we can look at these types of ads, and even something as simple as deodorant or a sandwich or a suit, right, are sold to these very sexualized, demeaning depictions of women. And again, in a society where patriarchy does not reign, where men and women have equal standing, these types of ads, right, are seen for the bizarre type of ads that they are. And so at the end of this essay, Bell Hooks really talks about like the heart of feminism. And in fact, that's the name of this, right? Where she says that if like a society is truly going to embrace a real equal relationship, then it really has to be centered around this idea of restoring loving relationships. And again, I want to point out the fact that she's not arguing for a matriarchy. She's saying that feminism requires love. I think sometimes when people hear about feminism, what they think is like that all the women are going to go around and like kill every man, right? Until like the queen bee reigns supreme. And like that's not what feminism is actually about. It's not about disempowering men to set up a matriarchy. Instead, it's about this idea of restoring loving relationships. And so ultimately, patriarchal ethics, right, the ethics that are against feminist ethics, they require this type of impartiality, right, and the distance from relationships. Like again, if we go back to the consequentialist theories that we were talking about, right, there's all these kind of like different standards, like in utilitarianism, right? It's like, well, why would we consider the relationship that you have with people? Let's consider like what the ultimate benefit is, right? Like the most benefit for the most people. That's all we're like going to consider. Right, the reason why you're willing to allow your mother to die to save 5 random strangers deals with this impartiality. And so Hooks points out the fact that, right, if there is this, impartial, rational, like universal law that like exists, it's probably based in male characteristics and in male virtues. And so, what feminist ethics should be about is restoring these loving relationships and discovering what real love is, not these like peddled forms of love that have been accepted through these patriarchal cultures, by subverting these relationships that are based in this idea of an impartial, rational, universal rule that heavily favors men and discourages women from even having the right to vote, but in a larger sense of having a meaningful life in general. And so, if this is true, ethics itself really is kind of a twofold nature. First of all, it's about creating these strong, loving bonds within the society, but then it's also about subverting those dominating relationships that destroy those loving bonds. So in one sense, it's empowering insofar as it's creating those loving bonds within the society, but it's also very directional in the sense that it is trying to subvert, get rid of those dominating, submitting relationships, because ultimately that's going to destroy the notion of loving relationships to begin with. So the last thing that I would emphasize about feminism is also this idea of sometimes what's referred to as egalitarianism. Sometimes it's called mutualism. But Bell Hooks actually does a really good job of defining this at the end of her essay. She says, love can never take root in a relationship based on domination. Feminist thinking and practice emphasize the value of mutual growth and self-actualization in partnerships and in parenting. And in looking at that, really the roots, the basis of love itself from a feminist ethic is this idea of finding a relationship that emphasizes mutual growth and self-actualization. She talks about these women in second wave feminism who, they were in these very abusive relationships with their husbands, and they left their husbands thinking that really men were the problem. And what she ends up pointing out is that they get in these lesbian relationships that have the same kind of dynamic, where one person is dominating the other, and the other person is submitting, and there's really no mutual growth or self-actualization that's happening in the relationship, because again, one person is simply taking advantage of the other. And so again, the idea here isn't, well, it's just men are the problem, and so let's get rid of men. But it's the fact that being in a relationship where someone is dominating you is a problem. Being in a relationship where you never grow as a human being, where you never form a strong bond with another person is a problem. And so feminist ethics is not based on the fact that like we will destroy the power that men have, It's based on the fact that empowerment should be about people forming these strong relationships, should be about people growing as human beings and self-actualizing their own desires. And what's interesting to me about this is that, she talks about how this can be empowering not just for women, but for men as well. If we go back and think about those ads for a moment, one thing that I would point out is, again, a man who thinks of himself as less of a man because he doesn't live up to the standard that men have created in their own society, has just as much to gain from feminism as a woman that Bell Hooks describes is in one of these abusive types of relationships. But both need a society that allows people to self-actualize and to grow as human beings. And so with that being said, the last theory I want to focus on here is the ethics of care. And the ethics of care comes from feminist ethics, but it has a different conception of how we focus on agency-based ethics. So to really start thinking about the ethics of care, I think it's important to go back for a moment and look at how it developed. And the founder, Carol Gilligan, who is pictured here, she really developed the ethics of care as a response to who she was the understudy for, Lawrence Kohlberg. And Kohlberg's theory of moral development, it's still taught today. People still look at it as being a valid developmental theory of morality. And she really disagreed with how Kohlberg concluded from his moral theory of development that women tended to show a lack of moral judgment compared to men. And there's a question that I will talk about with you all later of how he would decide this particular idea. But what is important in recognizing the ethics of care and how it's related to feminism is that Gilligan looked at Kohlberg's theory through a feminist lens and gave it kind of a feminist critique. And so in order to understand the development of the ethics of care, I want to first just kind of point out Kohlberg's view about morality. And I want to point it out not just because of its development as being crucial towards the ethics of care. I also want to point it out because it actually touches upon some of the theories that we talked about, and really all of the theories that we talked about last week. So if we look at Kohlberg's theory overall, I think it's interesting, especially looking at it from a consequentialist standpoint, because it really kind of pushes a lot of the ideas that we've already looked at in consequentialism. And in fact, you could almost describe Kohlberg's theory as basically this movement from egoism to social contract theory to utilitarianism. I think what's really interesting in looking at this moral development, and again, Kohlberg sees this as a movement from our early infancy and preschool age to school age to teenage years, and then ultimately adulthood. But what I think is interesting about this development is the fact that it's rooted in the belief of obedience and punishment. And there's actually a long line of philosophers who use this rule of obedience and punishment as kind of the mechanism for deciding the roots of morality ourselves. And I think it's a fair argument to say that individuals are prone towards forms of obedience and punishment as kind of a primitive instinct. And so What Kohlberg kind of points out at the beginning is that when we first learn about the world, when we first make judgments about what is right and wrong, we do it through this obedience and punishment kind of mechanism. I'll let you, if you want to pause and just kind of look over the slide here. But gradually self-interest takes over, and we start to adopt a notion of self-interest as being more than just our own interest, but being part of a more kind of collective, as the slide says here, right, mutual benefit, reciprocity kind of concept that eventually for Kohlberg forms a utilitarian framework, and we start building out some of what we might call universal principles. That is that morality itself transcends just the benefits that we get, but there's something universal about it as well. And when we get into deontology, we'll talk even more about that idea of the universal principle. But Kohlberg looks at this, not Kohlberg, Gilligan looks at this development differently than Kohlberg does. So I want to take a moment to look at her kind of critique of it. So Gilligan reframes this obedience punishment paradigm that Kohlberg develops as a primary way of developing morality, and she instead frames it as this notion about this orientation towards individual survival. And what's interesting about this is there are ways in which you could see that both of these ideas are truer than the other idea, right? So if we go back and think about the obedience versus punishment, we can think of probably plenty of times where we do things to avoid punishment or as an act of obedience, particularly between children and adults, that there seems to be that operating kind of schema. But on the flip side of that, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, is that really based off of a desire to obey, a desire to avoid punishment, or is it more about our desire to survive, right? Do we ultimately end up conforming to the social values of whatever place that we're around because we want to survive or because we want to obey? And I think what's really interesting is there are a number of studies that we could look at, particularly involving feral children. That is, children that are, raised not by humans but by animals. And we see that in a lot of cases, their lifespan is cut short. But we also see that they've adopted the methods of whatever they were raised by, and so it's very hard for them to exist coherently in the human world. And so I think that Gilligan has a very interesting point here about that our natural orientation is towards survival and not necessarily towards obedience and punishment. And then from there, drawing this distinction, things only get more refined from this point on, because what Kohlberg sees as this orientation towards like conformity and basically trying to learn this kind of social game that we play. Gilligan interprets that as instead learning a different kind of aspect of goodness. That goodness again comes from this survivor instinct that we have. That care in some ways is an innate part of our human capacity. And so based off of that, we start to learn that goodness involves our self-sacrifice, as the slide points out. Right? A person, as they get older, learns that they can't just choose all of the games that they want to play, that their friends want to play different games. And so they sacrifice a part of themselves in order to appease the people that they're with. But of course, that's not the entire story either, because as we see in the final stage here, there comes a point at which the person realizes that they can't entirely sacrifice themselves and still be who they are. there comes this moment where they realize that there are some things that they have to do because that's who they are, and there are some things that they're willing to compromise on. And so Gilligan, calls this the morality of nonviolence, and of course that's very different than thinking about universal principles that allow people to be good. In fact, if we look at Kohlberg's theory of morality, this is often sometimes referred to as a justice orientation, where we try to come up with very specific rules and specific ways of working in the world. Whereas a care orientation that Gilligan develops is based much more on our relationship and interaction with other people. Sometimes to explain this difference, I think it's helpful to think about a good game of Monopoly. And if you think about this just for a moment, a game of Monopoly can really be played a number of different ways. But if we use these two different paradigms that we're talking about, justice orientation and care orientation, justice-oriented individuals often tend to play Monopoly by focusing on the rules of Monopoly. So someone who is a justice-oriented individual, that they're going to, find out if you land on free parking, right? Do we collect all of the money and pull it together, and the person who lands on free parking gets that money? When can we start putting houses on? Do you have to have a monopoly first? Is there an auction, right, for properties over a certain amount of time? And they'll find out all of the kind of rules of the game. And in the end, the objective for someone who has a justice orientation is to say, like, you play to win the game. As Ed Reed once said, right? You play to win the game. Or Ed Bowles, not Ed Reed, sorry. And so looking at that, we might say, right, well, that's how everyone plays Monopoly, right? Isn't that the point of playing any game? But care-oriented individuals look at Monopoly a very different way, right? Instead of focusing on specific rules of the game, they might focus on whether or not everyone is enjoying the game. And so if, for instance, someone has really bad luck at the beginning, right? They land on that dreaded income tax. They land on all the properties that no one can own, right? They land on chance a bunch of times, and they get all these cards that make them pay. They go around the whole board, and it's just everyone's owning properties and they don't have anything. A care-oriented individual will look at that and say, well, you know what? Let's change the rules a little bit here, right? Let's make it so that this person can have fun too. In fact, when I first taught my daughter Monopoly, I come from a very justice-oriented family. We're extremely competitive, and right, we definitely believe that you play to win the game. But I remember when I was teaching my daughter Monopoly for the first time, this exact same thing happened to her. And I said to myself, I can't let my daughter lose Monopoly, right? Especially this first time around, right? And so I did exactly what the care-oriented person does. Right? I said, hey, let's move some of this cash over to my daughter here, right? Let's change up the rules a little bit. And the objective from a care-oriented person is that, right, you play the game to have fun. And winning doesn't really matter. It's about whether or not everyone is enjoying themselves, whether or not you're having fun while you're playing the game. And so these two different orientations obviously also have something important to focus on in ethics as well. Understanding that that's the background of how the ethics of care developed, I think it's important to focus on what the ethics of care actually says. And so looking at the reading that you had for Day in the case of Mr. Jones, I think you can probably already start to see in that reading some of the big notions about the ethics of care. In the ethics of care, the guiding moral principle, just like in egoism, it's self-interest, and in social contract theory, it's common interest, and utilitarianism, it's minimizing pain and maximizing happiness. The guiding moral principle in the ethics of care is response. And that response itself is really emphasized in a couple of different ways. First, relationships are conceived of through this role of caregivers and care receivers. So instead of there being the dominator-submitter kind of paradigm that exists in feminism that's trying to be subverted, in ethics of care, it's really encouraged that throughout our lives, we play these different roles as caregivers and care receivers. And these roles sometimes reverse themselves. I think probably the best example of this is, children are often taken care of by their parents. But, as parents grow older and children get older, there comes a moment where these roles often reverse. And you see that as children transition into adulthood and live full lives themselves, and the adults who are their parents take care of them and start to wean away in some of their faculties. You'll see that the children who have moved to adulthood are now taking care of their elderly parents. And this is true in a lot of other ways as well, right? There are plenty of bosses who mentor people underneath them, and those people later become, not just bosses themselves, but bosses of their bosses, right? That they learn the organization really well. And so there's not a fixed point of that people are always going to be caregivers and never care receivers, or vice versa. But the way in which the relationships are conceived of is in these notions of someone is giving care and someone is receiving it. Caring itself is this continuum that is based on emotion and understanding, and really the main idea in the ethics of care about our response is that when we fail to respond with emotion and understanding, it's this kind of target that we're trying to hit between having the right emotional investment and the right type of understanding. When that doesn't happen, that's when we start seeing the implications of narcissism. That's when we start seeing the implications of egoism and utilitarianism working their way out and seeping into our lives. It's because we fail to maintain a proper care that the world ends up becoming a worser place. And so the final thing, and this is actually a lot of times the beginning sort of place of the ethics of care, is that we shouldn't undermine the role of care, because when we do, it introduces a distorted view of ourselves. And so this includes self-care. It includes making sure that we understand that we need to take care of ourselves before we can take care of other people. And in fact, that is referred to as the principle of autonomy, right? And understanding that individuals need a level of autonomy in order to be able to give good care. They themselves have to first take care of themselves. Kind of like when you're on an airplane and the masks fall down. Obviously, you're going to put the mask on first before you can help put the mask on somebody else. And so if we think about the case of Mr. Jones for a second, there's a lot of ways in which these principles play out. I think we could talk about them in a number of different ways, but I want to start off by focusing on that idea about the right response being this target between emotion and understanding. And so the first idea about emotional response, it's really this idea that you have to have the right kind of emotional response. If you have too much emotional investment in something, that's gonna cloud the response that you're able to give. This is, for instance, the reason why we don't let surgeons do surgery on their family members. Is because even though they may be very talented surgeons, if they do something in the middle of surgery that's unexpected or perhaps even wrong, that their response is probably going to be too emotionally triggering for them to really have the right response. And by the same token, if there's too little response, then the problem, too little emotional investment, then the problem is that that's a bad response as well. I mean, in fact, one of the things that the ethics of care kind of pushes towards is the fact that people sometimes are reduced to things like a stereotype, and when that happens, the person is made into a stereotype. It's made in such a way that your emotional investment in that person can be taken away because you see that person functioning as that stereotype instead of seeing that person functioning as a human being. And so from the ethics of care standpoint, stereotypes are very dangerous because they create a sense of identity without actually giving the person an identity. And so if we think for a moment here on this first line about what is the emotional response for the case of Mr. Jones, we see that there's a lot of stereotype that happens around Mr. Jones. He's an amputee, he's an alcoholic, he's lost his wife. And so there's lots of reasons to write Mr. Jones off as just being those types of stereotypes, of being those type of things. And so again, from the doctor's standpoint, at least, there isn't maybe the proper kind of emotional investment that should go along with Mr. Jones. But then if we look at it on the other end about understanding, this is where I think the ethics of care is probably the most interesting, is because we have on one end the too little aspect of understanding. And to be honest, I think most people don't have a problem knowing why too little understanding will yield the wrong response. You can only really respond to something that you understand. If someone is having a heart attack, someone is choking on a plane, and someone stands up and asks for a volunteer, but you don't know how to help a person who's choking, you don't know how to help a person who's having a heart attack, then even though you may emotionally connect with that individual, you can't really respond in a meaningful way towards them because you don't have the understanding of being able to do that. But on the other end, people may wonder, well, what about too much? How is that even possible to respond too much with understanding? Isn't it kind of important that we have too much understanding all of the time, because then we'd have a good response? And I think the doctor actually serves as a really good case study in this reading about how a person can have too much understanding. Because when you compare the doctor's response to the nurse's response, it's obvious that even though the doctor has more medical training, even though the doctor can read the chart and derive all this other understanding from it that the nurse may not be able to, the doctor's understanding is in some ways blocking his ability to actually make a meaningful response towards his patient. The nurse knows a lot about the patient through their emotional connection. She knows, for instance, that the regular dosage of pain medication won't work on Mr. Jones for the simple fact that Mr. Jones doesn't respond the same way towards that. And so, again, this is a way where understanding is this target that we're trying to shoot for. And we need that understanding to be within the right limits, not only of the emotional response, but also of the knowledge response, of the understanding about the individual. And so this is what's really kind of meant by the idea that we want individuals to have the right response. It's this target of the right emotion and the right understanding connecting together. And so the last thing I want to touch upon is this idea of the principle of autonomy. And what I really mean by that is realizing that individuals have the capability to act on their own volition, that they have the ability to act on their own desire. And so, in looking at the ethics of care, there's a couple of things that we could extract from the reading. Probably the most important thing that's said in this entire article, this entire kind of case study, is the sentence that says care orientation is the beginning of caring. This is particularly true for nurses, but to a larger extent, if we think about what the ethics of care really means. It means that there is a certain orientation a person has in the beginning to provide care for people. And without this particular orientation, the ethics of care may seem like any other kind of like frivolous ethical theory. And again, just to go back for a moment in a way in which a person doesn't have a care orientation, or a way in which it can get sidetracked, is thinking about that notion about like a stereotype. Again, as I've got written on the slide here, when the orientation of that individual begins from that framework, from stereotyping somebody, sometimes what's called othering them, or thinking of the person as something different than what they actually are. The care that's going to be given to them, no matter how skillful it may be, is still going to be with a misunderstood type of care, and ultimately will not be as beneficial as it could be. And so, in thinking about this, there's really kind of two ideas that are important to play with and think about in giving good care and in embracing the ethics of care. And both of them are ideas that we've already kind of touched upon, but I just want to emphasize them before we finish out here. So the first one is this notion about the fact that the caregiver has to have their own emotional stability, and that comes from making sure that the person is actually able to take care of themselves. Until the caregiver gives good care to themselves first, the care that they give to other people will not be, again, at the same level that it could be at. I think this is particularly true of people who are in really difficult circumstances and can't always identify the fact that they're not taking care of themselves. You see people who, they are themselves taking care of individuals who have really difficult situations. So, parents who are dealing with children who have things like reactive attachment disorder, or spouses who have husbands or wives that have post-traumatic stress disorder from war trauma, or many other forms of trauma that are out there. Sometimes that can be a taxing enterprise themselves, just to give care to people who are in those kinds of situations. And so it's important to recognize at the very beginning that the person who is the caregiver in the relationship, they themselves have to be able to not neglect themselves in order to be able to give effective and good care. And then the second principle is that the caregiver themselves should, as far as possible, strive for the care receiver's independence. That is, you eventually want to get to a place where the person who is receiving the care doesn't need your help anymore, that they are able to grow from that care, and obviously maybe perhaps even be a caregiver themselves. Now, the important thing is you have to maintain the context of the situation. So this is going to mean something different in each situation. For instance, there are children who you're not going to be like, okay, I took care of this 4-year-old and now they've become 5 years old, so right, they're fully free and autonomous now, they can go live their life, right? Obviously that there's still a lot of growth that needs to happen, and the circumstances of that situation need to be understood. But insofar as you can advocate for that person's independence, So even though you may not send your 5-year-old out to go live on their own, you still want to see their own growth, their own personality shining through in the care that's given to them. And so this is what's meant by that principle of autonomy is, not only do you care for yourself, but the people who you care for, the people who you give care to, you should want for them to foster and develop their own sense of independence as much as possible. And again, you can probably see some parallels with this to the egalitarian model that is in feminism. But I'd point out if we look at feminism and the ethics of care, the main difference between these two theories is the conception of the relationship. In feminism, it is entirely focused on this egalitarian kind of model where both people are growing and self-actualizing from the relationship. In the ethics of care, though, the model of the relationship is centered much more around this idea that one person is going to be giving care and one person is going to be receiving care. And most relationships really fall into a category that surrounds that kind of paradigm. I appreciate all of your listening here, but this concludes our discussion on the ethics of care. Thank you.